Come sit here with me a spell. The evening light is getting soft now, and there's a chill settling in that reminds me of the old days, back when we measured our year by what we put away for winter. Let me tell you about those times, about the way we prepared when the frost was coming. You see, when September turned the leaves and October brought that first real cold snap, we knew it was time. Time to put up everything the garden had given us through the long growing months. We called it putting up, and it was more than just work. It was the rhythm of survival, done slow and steady, the way everything worthwhile gets done. Now, the tomatoes. We'd have bushels and bushels of tomatoes by then. The vines would be heavy with them, some still green. Most of them that deep red that tells you summer has given you everything it has. We'd pick them all, every last one, and bring them up to the house in wooden baskets that had served 3 generations before us. The kitchen would smell of tomato vine for days. That green, sharp smell on your hands, no matter how many times you wash them. We'd start with the stewing tomatoes. You'd blanch them first, you see. You'd put a big pot of water on the wood stove and wait for it to come to a rolling boil. That could take a good while, depending on how hot you had the fire going. Then you'd take each tomato, maybe 6 or 7 at a time, and lower them into that boiling water with a slotted spoon. You'd count to 30 slow. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 30. Then you'd lift them out careful and put them straight into a basin of cold water we'd drawn from the well that morning. The skins would slip right off then. You'd hold each tomato in your palm, make a little cut with your paring knife, and the skin would just peel away like it was never meant to be there permanent. Underneath, that flesh would be firm and bright, almost glowing. You'd core them then, cutting out that hard white part at the stem end, and quarter them. Each tomato would fall into quarters in your hand, and you'd put them in the jars. We used mason jars mostly, quart jars for the tomatoes. You'd pack them in there, not too tight, not too loose. Leave about an inch of headspace at the top. That's what my grandmother taught me, and her mother taught her. You'd add a half teaspoon of salt to each jar. Just regular non-iodized salt, nothing fancy. Some folks would add a little sugar, maybe a 1/4 teaspoon, to cut the acid, but we never did. We liked them pure. Then you'd fill the jar up with the tomato juice that had collected in the bowl while you were working. If you didn't have enough juice, you'd add boiling water from the kettle. You'd take a wooden spoon handle, slide it down the inside of the jar, gentle, like, to release any air bubbles that might be trapped in there. Air bubbles could spoil a whole jar, so you had to be patient with this part. The lids came next. We'd have the flat lids simmering in a small pot of hot water, not boiling, just hot enough to soften that rubber seal. You'd lift one out with your magnetic lid lifter, shake off the excess water, and place it right on top of the jar. Then you'd screw on the metal ring, just finger tight. Not too tight, or the air couldn't escape during processing. Not too loose, or water would get in. Now comes the boiling part, and this is where time really stretched out. You'd have your biggest pot on the stove, your canning pot if you had one, or just the biggest stock pot you owned. At the bottom, you'd lay a dish towel, folded twice. That towel kept the jars from rattling against the metal bottom, kept them from cracking with the heat. You'd fill that pot with water, enough to cover the jars by at least an inch once they were in there, and you'd bring it to a boil. When the water was ready, you'd lower the jars in one at a time using your jar lifter. That was a special tool, curved metal arms that gripped the jar by its neck. You'd set each jar down on that towel, making sure they weren't touching each other. 7-quart jars would fit in our big pot. Then you'd wait for the water to come back to a full boil, and once it did, you'd start timing. 45 minutes for quart jars of tomatoes. You'd sit there and tend that fire, keeping it steady, keeping that water at a rolling boil for the full 45 minutes. The steam would fill the kitchen, fog up the windows. You could feel the heat of it, damp and heavy. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't turn down the fire to save wood. It had to boil, steady and true, for the full time. When the timer went off, you'd turn off the fire and let the jars sit in the hot water for 5 more minutes. This part kept them from cracking when they hit the cooler air. Then, one by one, you'd lift them out and set them on another folded towel on the counter, spacing them apart so air could move around them. And then you'd wait. You'd wait and you'd listen, because within the next few hours, you'd hear it. That ping. That beautiful, certain ping of the lid sealing itself tight. The center of the lid would suck down flat, and you'd know that jar was sealed. That it would keep through the winter, through the spring if you needed it to. Each ping was a small victory, a promise kept. We'd do this for days. Tomatoes, then green beans. The beans took longer to pick through. You'd snap the ends off each one, pull the string down the side if there was one. Some beans were stringless, but the old heirloom varieties, they had strings tough as sewing thread. You'd snap them into 1.5-inch pieces, blanch them the same way as the tomatoes, pack them in jars with salt water, and process them even longer. 90 minutes for beans, because they were a low-acid food, and you had to be more careful. Then there were the pickled beans, what some folks called shuck beans. Those were different. You'd take your green beans and thread them on a string, using a big needle and heavy thread. You'd make long garlands of beans, maybe 6 feet long, and hang them up in a dry place. The back porch was good if it was covered and got a breeze. You'd leave them there for weeks until they dried completely, shriveled up and leathery. They'd turn a dusty brown color, and they'd keep that way indefinitely. When you wanted to cook them, you'd break off what you needed, soak them overnight in water to plump them back up, then cook them low and slow with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock. They'd simmer for hours, and the smell would fill the house, smoky and rich and deep. The taste was concentrated, more intensely bean than fresh beans ever were. Some folks called them leather britches instead of shuck beans. Either way, they were a staple, something you could count on when the snow was deep and the root cellar was running low. The apples came next. We had 3 old apple trees on the property, varieties nobody could name anymore. One gave us early apples, August apples, pale yellow and good for eating fresh. The second tree ripened in September, red apples with white flesh, perfect for cooking. The third tree gave us late apples, October apples, that would keep in the cellar until January if you stored them right. We'd dry some of the apples. You'd peel them, core them, slice them thin as you could make them. 1/4-inch slices, consistent so they'd dry evenly. We'd lay them out on screens we'd made from old window frames covered with cheesecloth. You'd set those screens in the sun during the day, bring them in at night so the dew wouldn't dampen them. It took 3 or 4 days of good sun to dry them completely. Once they were dry, leathery and pliable, but with no moisture left in them, you'd pack them in jars or cloth bags and keep them in a dry place. In winter, you'd stew them with a little sugar and cinnamon, cook them down until they were soft and sweet. Or you'd use them in stack cake, that traditional Appalachian wedding cake made of thin layers with dried apple filling between each one. The more layers, the fancier the wedding. Some apples we'd make into applesauce. You'd peel and core them, though some folks left the peels on for color. You'd cut them into chunks, put them in a big pot with just enough water to keep them from scorching, and cook them down slow. You'd mash them as they cooked, using a potato masher or the back of a wooden spoon. When they were soft and smooth, you'd add sugar to taste, maybe some cinnamon, and pack the sauce hot into jars. Process them in the boiling water bath for 20 minutes, and you'd have applesauce all winter long. Then there was the bachelor's jam. That's what we called it, though I don't know the real reason for the name. Maybe because it was simple enough for a man living alone to make, Or maybe because it was made with whatever fruit you had on hand. No careful measurements, no fussing. You'd cook down any fruit, berries mostly, with sugar, until it was thick. You'd pour it into jars while it was still hot. And here's the special part. You'd pour a thin layer of whiskey on top, maybe a 1/4 inch, before you sealed it. That whiskey, we called it hoach, would float on top of the jam and keep it from molding. The alcohol would evaporate mostly during the cooking process and over time, but it left a faint warmth to the flavor, a complexity that plain jam didn't have. The jam underneath would keep for months that way, the hoach forming a protective seal. When you opened a jar, you'd stir that layer back into the jam, or skim it off if you preferred. Either way, it worked. We'd put up pickles too. Cucumber pickles, mostly, though we'd pickle other things as well. Beets, sometimes. Watermelon rind, when we had watermelon. The cucumbers would be packed in jars with dill, garlic, peppercorns, and a hot brine made from vinegar, water, and salt. You'd process them quick, just 10 minutes, or you'd let them ferment naturally in a crock, down in the cellar where it was cool and dark. The meat got preserved too, though differently. We'd butcher a hog in late fall, when the weather turned cold enough to keep the meat from spoiling while you worked. That was hard work, all-day work, work that required help from neighbors. But once it was done, you'd have meat for the winter. The hands and shoulders would be dry cured with salt. You'd pack them completely in salt, every surface covered, and lay them in a wooden box in a cool place. After a few weeks, you'd brush off the excess salt, coat them with black pepper to keep the flies off, and hang them in the smokehouse. They'd hang there for months, curing slowly, developing that deep, complex flavor that only time and smoke can create. The bacon would be cured the same way. The side meat would be packed in salt, weighted down, left for weeks. Then you'd rinse off the salt, let it dry, and smoke it. We'd use hickory wood mostly, though some folks preferred apple wood or oak. The smoke would permeate the meat, preserving it and flavoring it at the same time. Sausage was different. You'd grind the trim meat, the pieces that weren't good for anything else. Mix it with salt, pepper, sage, and a little red pepper if you liked heat. You'd stuff it into casings made from the hog's intestines, cleaned and scraped and turned inside out. Or you'd form it into patties and fry them up, and pack them in jars covered with rendered lard. The lard would harden and seal out the air, and those sausages would keep for months. The lard itself was precious. You'd render it from the fat, cutting the fat into small pieces, cooking it slow in a big pot until the fat melted and the solids, the cracklings, turned golden and crispy. You'd strain the liquid fat through cheesecloth into jars or crocks, where it would cool and solidify into pure white lard. That lard would be used for everything: baking, frying, preserving, making soap. Now all of this, all these jars and crocks and hanging meats, they had to go somewhere. That's where the root cellar came in. Every homestead had one, or should have. Ours was dug into the hillside behind the house, 6 feet underground, the traditional depth. 6 feet down, the earth stays at a constant temperature, cool but not freezing, somewhere between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. The cellar had a door at ground level, a heavy wooden door that opened onto stone steps leading down into the earth. The walls were fieldstone, fitted together without mortar, with earth packed behind them. The floor was packed earth too, though some folks laid down flat stones. The ceiling was made of logs, covered with earth and grass, thick enough to insulate. Inside, it was dark and cool, and smelled of earth and stone and the particular smell of stored food. Wooden shelves lined the walls, floor to ceiling, and on those shelves we'd place everything we'd put up. The jars of tomatoes and beans and pickles and fruit, the crocks of sauerkraut and fermented pickles, the earthenware jars of lard and sausage. In the corners and along the floor, we'd have wooden bins and baskets. Potatoes, hundreds of pounds of potatoes, stored loose so air could circulate around them. You'd go through them every week or so, removing any that had started to rot before they could spoil the others. The potatoes would keep until spring that way, as long as the cellar stayed cool and dark. Rutabagas, too. Those big yellow turnips that some folks call Swedes. They'd keep even better than potatoes, staying firm and sweet through the winter. You'd roast them with a little butter and salt, or mash them with potatoes, or add them to stews. Carrots would be stored in boxes of damp sand. You'd layer them in the sand, not touching each other, and the sand would keep them from drying out. They'd stay crisp that way, as fresh-tasting in February as they were in October. Onions and garlic would hang from the ceiling in mesh bags or braided by their dried tops. You'd harvest them in summer. Let them cure in the sun until their skins were papery and dry, and braid the tops together in long ropes. They'd hang there, swaying slightly when you walked past, and you'd cut off what you needed as you needed it. Apples, those late-keeping apples, would be wrapped individually in newspaper and packed in wooden crates, each apple not touching its neighbor. That kept them from bruising each other and slowed down the ripening. Some would still go soft, still develop brown spots, but most would keep well into winter. The root cellar was more than just storage. It was security. It was the knowledge that no matter what winter brought, how deep the snow got, how long the cold lasted, you had food. You had what you needed to survive. To thrive even, because you'd prepared properly when the time was right. But we weren't the only ones preparing. The natural world around us was doing the same thing, following rhythms even older than our traditions. Every creature, from the largest bear to the smallest mouse, had their own way of getting ready for winter, and if you paid attention, you could learn from watching them. The black bears, now, they had the most dramatic preparation. Starting in late summer, they'd begin to gorge themselves. They'd eat and eat and eat, consuming vast quantities of food, because they knew, in that deep instinctive way, that they needed to build up their reserves. A bear could gain as much as 30 pounds in a single week during this period. 30 pounds. That's like a bear putting on a full-grown toddler's worth of weight every 7 days. They'd eat anything they could find. Acorns were a favorite when the oak trees had a good mast year. A mast year, that's when the trees produce an abundant crop of nuts and seeds. The bears would sit under the oaks for hours, methodically picking up acorns and crunching them, shells and all. Their powerful jaws would crack the shells like they were nothing, and they'd swallow them down, acorn after acorn after acorn. They'd eat berries by the thousands. Blackberries, blueberries, huckleberries, any berry they could reach. They'd strip a berry patch bare in an afternoon. Their paws delicate despite their size, picking the berries carefully from the thorny canes. Insects, too. They'd tear apart rotting logs to get at the beetle larvae inside, lick up ants by the hundreds, dig up yellow jacket nests, and eat the larvae and the honey-like substance the yellow jacket stored. A bear's metabolism during this time was remarkable. They could eat up to 20,000 calories a day, eating almost constantly during daylight hours, packing on the fat that would sustain them through the winter months. Because bears don't truly hibernate, you see. They enter a state called torpor, which is different. Their body temperature drops only slightly, from around 100 degrees to maybe 88 degrees. Their heart rate slows from 50 beats per minute down to 8 or 10. Their breathing becomes slow and shallow. But they're not as deeply asleep as a truly hibernating animal like a ground squirrel or a bat. They can wake up if disturbed, and mother bears even give birth during this time, in the dark of their dens, without fully waking. The white-tailed deer had their own strategy. They didn't sleep through winter like the bears. They stayed active, moving through the frozen landscape, searching for food. But their bodies changed to prepare for the hardship ahead. They'd put on weight too, though not as dramatically as the bears. They'd eat heavily through the fall, consuming as much as 9 pounds of food each day. 9 pounds doesn't sound like much when you say it fast, but think about it. A deer might weigh 150 pounds. Eating 9 pounds of food a day, that's 6% of their body weight every single day. If a human weighing 150 pounds ate proportionally, they'd need to consume 9 pounds of food daily. That's a tremendous amount of eating. And what they ate in winter was different from their summer diet. In summer, they'd browse on tender green leaves, fresh shoots, soft vegetation. But in winter, when those things weren't available, they'd switch to what we called winter mast. Acorns, when they could find them under the snow. Twigs and buds from trees and shrubs. The bark from young trees, which could damage or kill the trees if too many deer were feeding in an area. Dried leaves they'd dig out from under the snow. Even dried grasses, though those provided little nutrition. Their bodies adapted to extract every bit of nutrition from this poor quality food. Their digestive systems slowed down, processing the food more thoroughly. They'd move less, conserving energy, bedding down in sheltered spots during the worst of the weather. You'd see them in the same places, day after day, their beds melted into the snow, ovals of bare ground or matted leaves where they'd laid for hours. But the most remarkable adaptation was their winter coat. Starting in late fall, deer would grow a completely different coat than the one they wore in summer. The summer coat was short and reddish-brown, made of solid hairs that lay flat against the skin. The winter coat was longer, grayish-brown, and made of hollow hairs. Hollow hairs. Each individual hair was like a tiny tube filled with air. Air is one of the best insulators in nature, and by having thousands upon thousands of hollow hairs, the deer created a thick layer of insulation around their bodies. These hairs would stand up when it was cold, fluffed out by tiny muscles in the skin, trapping even more air close to the body. You could see this on a cold morning, the deer looking almost fuzzy, their coats puffed up, making them appear larger than they actually were. And then in spring, when the weather warmed and the new growth appeared, they'd shed this entire winter coat. You'd find patches of it caught on fences, on low branches, great tufts of gray-brown fur scattered across the landscape. Underneath would be the sleek summer coat, already grown in, ready for the warm months ahead. The birds had their own methods, and they were just as sophisticated. Birds that stayed through winter, the year-round residents like chickadees and cardinals and woodpeckers. They prepared differently than the deer or bears. They couldn't store body fat the way mammals could, at least not to the same degree. A bird needs to stay light enough to fly, so there's a limit to how much weight they can carry. Instead, they relied on fluffing. You'd see them on cold mornings, puffed up to twice their normal size, looking like round balls of feathers with a beak. This wasn't fat. This was air. Birds have several layers of feathers, but the important ones for warmth are the downy feathers, the soft, fluffy ones close to the skin. By contracting muscles in their skin, birds can make these downy feathers stand up, trapping air in the spaces between them. The principle is the same as the deer's hollow hairs. Air is the insulator, and the feathers create thousands of tiny air pockets. A chickadee, which might weigh only about half an ounce, can survive temperatures well below zero by fluffing its feathers and tucking its head under a wing to reduce heat loss. They'd also shiver to generate heat, burning calories to produce warmth. On the coldest nights, a small bird like a chickadee might use up to 10% of its body weight in stored fat just to stay alive until morning. That's why you'd see them feeding frantically during the day, constantly searching for seeds and insects, trying to build up reserves for the next night. Some birds would roost communally, huddling together in cavities or dense evergreens, sharing body heat. You might find a dozen bluebirds packed into a single nest box on a cold winter night, or a group of brown creepers spiraling together behind loose bark on a tree trunk. Together, they could maintain warmth that would be impossible alone. The woodpeckers would cache food, hiding acorns and nuts in holes they drilled in trees. An acorn woodpecker, if we'd had them here, would drill thousands of holes in a single tree and store an acorn in each one. Our local woodpeckers weren't quite that extreme, but they'd still hide food in crevices and cracks, remembering where they'd put it and returning when they needed it. Even the insects had their preparations, though you wouldn't see them. Many insects died off completely, leaving only eggs or pupae behind to survive the winter. These dormant stages were remarkably cold-hardy, able to survive temperatures that would kill the adult insects instantly. Some insects, like mourning cloak butterflies and certain species of beetles, would hibernate as adults, finding sheltered spots under bark or in leaf litter, going into a state of suspended animation. Their bodies would produce natural antifreeze compounds, glycerol, and other cryoprotectants that prevented ice crystals from forming in their tissues. Honeybees had perhaps the most sophisticated winter strategy of any insect. They'd stay active all winter, though confined to the hive. The worker bees would cluster around the queen in a tight ball, the bees on the outside of the cluster insulating those on the inside. They'd shiver their flight muscles without moving their wings, generating heat. The cluster would maintain a temperature of around 90 degrees Fahrenheit at its center, even when the outside air was far below freezing. The bees would rotate positions, those on the cold outside gradually working their way to the warm center, those in the center eventually moving out to the edge. They'd feed on the honey they'd stored during the warm months, thousands of pounds of honey if they'd had a good year, carefully rationed to last until spring flowers bloomed again. All of this, all these preparations by bears and deer and birds and insects, they were happening at the same time we were putting up our food and stocking our root cellars. The natural world and the human world, moving in parallel, both responding to the same signals. The shortening days, the cooling temperatures, the knowledge that winter was coming and preparation was necessary. And then, in the midst of this preparation, came the holiday season. The darkest time of year, when the sun set early and rose late, when the work of preparation was mostly done and the long waiting of winter began. That's when we turn our attention to Christmas, to bringing light and warmth into the dark season. The preparations for Christmas were different from putting up food. They were gentler, more reflective, focused on beauty and tradition rather than survival. Though, in a way, they were about survival too. Survival of the spirit during the dark months. We'd start by gathering greens. Cedar was the main one, what some folks called juniper, the eastern red cedar that grew wild on old fields and fence lines. You'd cut branches of it, careful to leave the tree healthy, taking only what you needed. The cedar had a sharp, clean smell that would fill the house when you brought it inside, a smell that said Christmas more than anything else. Holly, too, if you could find it. American holly, with its dark green leaves and red berries. You had to know where the holly trees were, because they weren't common, and you had to get there before the birds ate all the berries. The leaves were spiny, sharp enough to prick your fingers as you cut the branches, but beautiful, glossy, and perfect. Bittersweet was another favorite, though you had to be careful with it. American bittersweet, not the invasive oriental kind that came later. The vines would climb high into the trees, and in fall, the seed capsules would split open, revealing bright orange berries inside. You'd cut long lengths of the vine, carefully, and bring them home to drape over doorways and mantels. We'd make chains of popcorn, too. That was usually the children's job, though adults would help. You'd pop corn in a heavy pot on the stove, using a little lard to keep it from burning, shaking the pot constantly until the popping slowed and stopped. Then, when it had cooled enough to handle, you'd thread a needle with strong thread and push it through kernel after kernel, making long garlands. It was slow work, rhythmic work. The needle had to go through the fluffy part of the popped kernel, not through the hard kernel at the center, or the popcorn would shatter. You'd make yards and yards of these garlands, draping them on the cedar branches or stringing them along the walls. Cranberries, too, sometimes, if you could get them. They'd come from up north, brought in by train, expensive and special. You'd alternate cranberries and popcorn on the same string, red and white, threading them carefully. Some folks would make paper chains, cutting strips of newspaper or magazine pages, looping them and gluing them into links. Children would cut out paper snowflakes, folding paper squares into quarters and eighths, cutting notches and curves, then unfolding them to reveal intricate patterns. These would be hung in windows or taped to walls. And cotton. If you had raw cotton, you could pull it into fluffy clouds and arrange it on flat surfaces to look like snow. It wasn't realistic, not really, but it suggested winter, suggested the cold world outside while you were warm inside. Candles were important. We'd put a candle in each window, lit on Christmas Eve and on Christmas night. The light was to guide travelers, to show them where warmth and welcome could be found. Or that's what we said. Really, it was just beautiful. Those small, warm flames glowing in the darkness, visible from outside, turning the windows into beacons of light. The candles had to be watched carefully, of course. Fire was always a danger in old wooden houses. You'd set the candle on a plate or in a holder, away from curtains and greenery, and you'd check on them regularly throughout the evening. But the risk was worth it for the effect, for that particular quality of light that only candles provide, warm and alive and gentle. The Christmas tree itself, that wasn't as universal a tradition as you might think. Some families had them, some didn't. If you did, you'd go out and cut a small cedar or pine, bring it into the parlor, and set it up in a corner. You'd decorate it with the popcorn chains and paper ornaments, with strings of berries if you had them. Some folks would put small candles on the branches, held in special clip-on holders, though that was risky. More common than a tree was a putz, a nativity scene set up on a table or mantel. Some families would build elaborate landscapes, with moss for grass, little mirrors for ponds, twigs for trees, all arranged around the stable with its figures of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus, the shepherds and the wise men and the animals. Children would spend hours arranging and rearranging the figures, creating little scenes. And then there was the food preparation. Christmas dinner was a feast, the one day of the year when you'd bring out the best of what you'd preserved, when you'd cook special dishes that took time and skill. The centerpiece was usually a cured country ham, one of those hams that had been hanging in the smokehouse, curing for months. You'd bring it in a few days before Christmas, soak it overnight to remove some of the salt, then scrub it clean. On Christmas Eve, you'd put it in a pot, cover it with water, and simmer it for hours. 4 hours, maybe 5, for a 12-pound ham, simmering slow and gentle until the meat was tender. Then you'd take it out, let it cool enough to handle, and peel off the skin. Underneath, there'd be a layer of fat, and you'd score this in a diamond pattern, making shallow cuts in a crosshatch. You'd stud each diamond with a whole clove, pack the surface with brown sugar, and put the ham in the oven to glaze. The sugar would melt and caramelize, forming a sweet crust that contrasted with the salty, smoky meat. There'd be fruitcake, if you had the ingredients. Dark fruitcake, dense and heavy, made weeks in advance so it could age. You'd soak dried fruits, raisins and currants, and candied citrus peel in whiskey or brandy overnight. Then you'd cream butter and sugar, add eggs one at a time, fold in flour and spices, and finally fold in the soaked fruit and chopped nuts. The batter would be thick, more fruit and nuts than batter, and you'd pack it into pans and bake it slow for hours. Once it was baked and cooled, you'd wrap it in cloth soaked in more whiskey and store it in a tin. Every week, you'd unwrap it and brush it with more whiskey, letting it soak in, keeping the cake moist and developing the flavors. By Christmas, it would be dark and rich and potent, a small slice satisfying in a way that lighter cakes never were. Mincemeat pie was another traditional dish, brought over by Scottish and English settlers. Despite the name, it often didn't contain actual meat, though the old recipes did include suet or even chopped beef, along with the dried fruits and spices. The filling would be made weeks ahead, the fruits and spices mixed together and left to meld, developing a deep, complex flavor. On Christmas Day, you'd make pie crust, roll it thin, line your pie pans. Fill them with the mincemeat, and top them with another layer of crust or with a lattice. You'd bake them until the crust was golden and the filling was bubbling, and serve them warm, maybe with a dollop of fresh cream if you had a cow that was still milking. And rosettes. These were special. Rosettes were delicate, crispy cookies made by dipping a decorative iron form into thin batter and then into hot fat for frying. The iron would be heated in the fat first, then dipped in the batter so a thin coating stuck to it, then back into the fat. The batter would puff and crisp, forming a delicate, flower-shaped cookie. The batter was simple: eggs, milk, flour, sugar, a pinch of salt. But the technique took practice. If the iron was too hot, the batter wouldn't stick. If it was too cool, the rosette would be greasy and heavy. You needed the temperature just right, and you needed a steady hand to dip and lift and drain. The finished rosettes would be dusted with powdered sugar while they were still warm, and they'd be piled on a plate, a tower of delicate, sweet, crispy confections. They'd shatter when you bit into them, dissolving almost instantly, leaving just a memory of sweetness. All of this cooking, all this preparation, it would fill the house with smells that meant Christmas. The spices in the fruitcake, cinnamon and cloves and allspice. The sweet glaze on the ham. The crispy, eggy smell of the rosettes frying. The cedar branches releasing their scent in the warmth of the house. It all combined into something that couldn't be separated, that meant home and safety and celebration. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was warm and the candles were lit, that's when the old stories would come out. The gentle stories, the ones that connected us to the past and to the land and to the mysteries that we lived alongside. One of the oldest stories, one that went back beyond memory, was about the animals on Christmas Eve. The story said that at midnight on Christmas Eve, or on Old Christmas Eve, which was January 5th by our calendar, the animals would kneel. All of them, all at once, in fields and forests and barns. They'd kneel facing east, toward where the Christ child had been born so many centuries ago. And for a moment, they would speak. Not in human language, the story said, but in their own voices, clear and knowing. The cows in the barn would low softly, and if you were listening, truly listening, you might understand what they were saying. The horses would whinny, gentle and low. The sheep would bleat, all together, like a choir. The wild animals, too, out in the forest. The deer would stop their browsing and kneel in the snow, their heads bowed. The rabbits would sit perfectly still, ears up, facing east. Even the birds, roosting in the trees, would wake for that one moment and turn their heads toward the east, silent and reverent. The story said this happened at the exact moment of Christ's birth, that moment when divinity entered the world through the gate of a stable, witnessed first by animals. The ox and the donkey, the story went, had warmed the newborn with their breath, and ever since, all animals remembered. Once a year, they acknowledged that moment, that mystery. Now, nobody I ever knew claimed to have actually seen this happen. The story was always something that someone's grandfather had told them, or that they'd heard from an old woman when they were children. It was understood that this wasn't something you could go out and observe, that the act of watching might prevent it from happening. It was something that occurred in the quiet, in the privacy of the animal's own experience. But the story served a purpose. It reminded us that the sacred wasn't separate from the ordinary, that the mystery of Christmas was connected to the land we lived on, the animals we lived with. It made the barn a holy place, in its way. It made us more gentle with the livestock, more aware that we shared the world with other creatures who had their own forms of knowing. Old Christmas now, that was a whole tradition in itself. When the calendar changed, back in the 1750s, 11 days were dropped to align with the new system. But some folks, especially in isolated mountain communities, kept celebrating on the old date. January 6th became Old Christmas, or Old Twelfth Night, and it had its own traditions. The main one was the belief that on the morning of January 5th, right before dawn, there would be two dawns. The first one would come early, maybe an hour before the real sunrise. The sky in the east would lighten, growing pale and then pink, as if the sun were about to rise. And for a few moments, the light would be strange and clear, not quite daylight, but not darkness either. In that light, the story said, you could see green. Not the brown and gray of winter, but actual green, as if spring had arrived for just those few minutes. The grass would look green, the moss on the trees would glow with color. Everything would be alive and growing, just for that brief time. And then the light would fade. The sky would darken again, back to the deep blue of pre-dawn, and the world would return to its winter colors. The true dawn would come later, at its proper time, ordinary and expected. Again, this wasn't something most folks claimed to have seen personally. It was always someone else, someone older, someone who'd gotten up early one old Christmas morning and witnessed it. But the story persisted, passed down through generations, believed or half believed or held as a beautiful possibility. And there was another old Christmas tradition, this one about the bees. Honeybees, kept in hives or in hollow logs. The tradition said that on Old Christmas Eve, from dusk until dawn, the bees in their hives would hum. Not the usual random buzzing of bees going about their business, but a specific musical humming. They would hum the melody of a carol, an ancient carol that dated back to the earliest days of Christianity. Nobody could say which carol it was. Some folks said it was a song so old it had no words anymore, just the melody, passed down through the bees themselves, from generation to generation. Others said it was a known carol. Maybe while shepherds watched their flocks, or the first Noel, but that the bees' version was different, slower, more solemn. If you were brave enough to go out in the cold and dark on Old Christmas Eve and stand near a beehive, pressing your ear close to the wood, you might hear it. The humming would be steady and low, all the bees vibrating their wings in unison, creating a single sustained note that would shift slowly, moving through a melody. Of course, bees do hum in winter. That much is true. They cluster together for warmth, and they shiver their flight muscles to generate heat, and that creates a humming sound. On a quiet night, standing near a hive, you can hear it. A low thrum that speaks of activity and life, even in the dead of winter. Whether that humming ever becomes musical, whether it ever follows the pattern of an ancient carol, that's the mystery. That's the part of the story that can't be proven or disproven, that exists in the space between the known and the unknown. These stories, these gentle mysteries, they were part of how we understood the world. They weren't scary stories, not tales meant to frighten or disturb. They were stories that made the world larger, more meaningful. They suggested that beneath the surface of ordinary life, there were layers of meaning and connection that we might glimpse but never fully understand. They made Christmas more than just a day on the calendar, more than just a celebration we'd inherited from elsewhere. They rooted the holiday in our specific place, connected it to the animals in our barns, and the bees in our hives, and the land we walked on every day. And in the telling of these stories, on long winter evenings when the darkness came early and stayed late, when the wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled in the stove, we were connected to everyone who'd ever told these stories before us. Back through the generations, through our grandparents and their grandparents, back to the people who'd first settled these mountains, bringing their stories with them and adapting them to this new place, the animals kneeling at midnight, the two dawns on old Christmas, the bees humming their ancient carol. These weren't facts in the way that the recipe for canning tomatoes was a fact, but they were true in a different way, true to the spirit of the season, true to the desire to find meaning and beauty in the darkest time of the year. And so we'd sit there in the warm house with its smell of cedar and wood smoke, with jars of preserved food lining the shelves, and a ham curing in the smokehouse, and the root cellar full of potatoes and apples. And we'd tell these stories. We'd speak them out loud, keeping them alive for another generation, passing them on like we passed on the knowledge of how to can tomatoes or render lard or cure a ham. Everything was connected. The practical work of putting up food and the spiritual work of keeping traditions. The rhythm of the seasons and the rhythm of our lives. The needs of the body for sustenance and the needs of the soul for meaning and beauty. It all fit together, one continuous whole, as natural and necessary as breathing. The winter would be long. There would be hard days, cold days, days when the snow was too deep to go outside except to tend the animals. Days when the food seemed monotonous, when you tired of eating from the same jars you'd put up months before. Days when the darkness and cold felt oppressive, endless. But knowing that you were prepared, that the root cellar was full, and the smokehouse was stocked, and the jars of preserved food would last until spring, that knowledge brought a deep peace. And having the stories, having the traditions, having the small rituals of lighting candles and decorating with cedar and telling tales of animals kneeling at midnight, those things fed a different kind of hunger. It was all part of the same understanding, the same wisdom that had been refined over generations of people living close to the land, dependent on it, in relationship with it. You prepared in the fall for what winter would bring. You preserved the abundance of summer to carry you through the scarcity of winter. You gathered with family and told stories and celebrated light in the darkness. You paid attention to the natural world and learned from it. You remembered the old ways and taught them to the young. And in doing all of this, in living according to these rhythms and patterns, you created a life that was sustainable, not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense too. A life that fed the body and the soul, that connected you to the past and prepared you for the future, that acknowledged both the practical needs of survival and the human need for beauty and meaning. The fire in the stove would burn low as the evening grew late. The candles would gutter down to stubs. Outside, the cold would deepen. The stars would wheel overhead. The animals in the barn would settle into their beds of straw. The world would be quiet, held in the grip of winter, waiting for the slow turn toward spring that wouldn't come for months yet. But inside, there was warmth. There was food enough. There were stories and memories, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. There was the knowledge that we had prepared properly, that we would make it through. That spring would come eventually, and the cycle would begin again. And that knowledge, that quiet confidence, was as nourishing as any food we'd put up. It let you rest. It let you settle into the winter, into the long waiting, without fear or anxiety. It let you sleep, knowing that everything that needed to be done had been done, that you were ready, that you were safe. The putting up was finished. The preserving was complete. The stories had been told. The candles had been lit. The long winter stretched ahead, but we were prepared for it, body and soul. We had done what needed doing, and now we could rest in the fruit of that labor, secure and peaceful, held by the rhythms of the seasons and the wisdom of the generations that had come before us. And so the evening would end, quiet and gentle, with the fire settling into coals and the house cooling slightly, and everyone making their way to bed, to sleep through the long winter night, to rest and dream and wake again to whatever the new day would bring, knowing that we were ready for it, knowing that we had everything we needed, knowing that we were, in all the ways that mattered, home. Well, now I imagine you've listened to me talk long enough for one evening. There's still some things to be done before bedtime. We will talk more at another time. I better let you go on now, before the fire in the stove gets much lower. I'm just going to sit here on the porch a bit longer, watching that moon clear the top of the ridge. It's a fine, quiet night. The kind of night where you can hear the mountain breathing if you listen close enough. You go on ahead and get settled. The blankets are heavy, and the house is tight against the wind. Everything that needs doing has been done. The jars are quiet in the cellar, and the wood is stacked high. You've got no more work to do until the sun finds us again. I'll be right here, just a shadow on the porch, keeping watch for a while. You close your eyes and let the sleep come slow, like the first snow of the year. I'll see you when the morning light hits the hollow. Sleep deep now, just rest easy. God bless you.